Today's webinar will cover the fundamentals of herbicides for weed control around the home and garden. We have weed expert Tom Getz to discuss how herbicides work, the effectiveness of various organic and synthetic herbicides, and how to choose the right herbicide for your weed problem. Tom is the Weed Ecology and Cropping Systems Advisor for UC Cooperative Extension in the Intermountain region of Northeastern California and an affiliate of the UC IPM program. Currently, his research and extension program focus on management in the forage-based cropping systems of his region and noxious weed control research, wherever they may grow. He completed his technical training at Colorado State University, obtaining a bachelor's degree in forestry management and then a master's degree in weed science. When not working, you will often find him with a fly rod in hand at one of the local lakes. We're grateful to have you join us today, Tom. You may now go ahead and share your slides.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for the introduction. And I appreciate the invitation to speak to everybody today. So I was asked to talk about herbicides. So to give you an idea of where I work, because some people may or may not be familiar with the Intermountain region, I work up here in the northeastern corner of California. So kind of on the border of Nevada and the border of Oregon. We have a lot of invasive weeds. We don't have a lot of people, and we have a lot of cows. So I do a lot of work with pest management in the mountains up here of Northern California. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is herbicides. And going to be talking a bit about some toxicity. I'm going to talk about labels over and over and over again. And then I'm going to get into some different definitions, and then when you might want to use organic herbicides, when you might want to use conventional herbicides and some of their properties, as well as how you might be able to apply these sorts of products and how to minimize off-target risk. So what are herbicides? Very simple definition is these are products or chemicals utilized to kill plants. The EPA defines them a little bit more eloquently as chemicals used to manipulate or control undesirable vegetation. So that's a pretty basic definition of herbicides. In terms of herbicides, one of the oldest ones that I can think of, and it is an effective herbicide, is salt. I'm sure many of you have heard of salting the fields of your enemies. And salt actually has the ability to control plants. You pour a bunch of salt on the ground and nothing's going to be able to grow because it actually inhibits the ability for plants to be able to draw water out of the soil. The downside to this is, salt's not the nicest stuff and nothing will grow. So, if you want bare ground, it's something that you might be able to look into. But when most people think about herbicides, you think about synthetic chemistries that started to come out around the time of World War II. The first one of these that is probably the most widely known is 2,4-D, which is good at controlling broadleaf weeds in the presence of grasses without hurting those grasses. And today we have about 260 of these different synthetic herbicides that are registered in the United States. So one thing that a lot of people I don't think realize when they're talking about pesticides is that these are probably some of the most regulated materials in our society. Here's a graphic from McDougall in 2016, where it was estimated that it would cost about $286 million to bring a new pesticide to market in 2014. So with inflation and stuff, this value certainly has grown. And the reason behind this is because we do a tremendous amount of science whenever we're registering a pesticide, looking at the toxicity of that pesticide, how it's going to work in the environment, the toxicology and environmental chemistry, as well as how it works. So there's a lot of science that goes into developing these pesticides and creating the labels that are on the products. And this is, like I said, a highly regulated process. All these different studies are done in terms of, ecological risks and human health assessments and how all these things are going to play out in the environment before they're ever released to consumers. And then this information is reviewed by the EPA so that anything that's written on the label is going to undergo some sort of risk assessment and is written in a way that you can feel pretty good that if you're applying a pesticide and you're following the label instructions, you're not going to have negative impacts on the ecology of the systems, and you're not going to have negative impacts on human health. One other thing that you can feel really good about with California is that we have our own Department of Pesticide regulation. So, as this process takes years by the EPA scientists to, get something registered, in order for it to come to California, it has to then be reevaluated by our own Department of Pesticide regulation, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of products outside of California that you can't utilize inside the state. So very highly regulated materials. And I really just want to point this out. The label is the law. Whenever you're using a pesticide, you need to be able to read, follow, and understand the entire label. And you can feel really good about those labels because there's a tremendous amount of research that goes into formulating those labels to protect users, to protect the environment, to give you good pest control. And this whole process is based on replicated science. However, when people think about pesticides and when people think about herbicides, they think about this danger, poison, and some things are highly toxic where others are not. Whenever you look at a pesticide, there's signal words that are going to be on the jug. Um, the first one, and these rate how acutely toxic that compound is inside the jug. So if you have a caution-based product, this means that it's a slightly toxic product. If you have a product that has warning on the label, it means it's moderately toxic. Whereas if you have a danger label, this means that it's a highly toxic product. And these definitions are straight taken from the National Pesticide Information Center, which is a great resource. I just wanted to give them a shout out. If you want to learn more about pesticides or have questions about specific products, this is a good first place to look. In terms of toxicity, because we're talking about pesticides, your route of exposure matters. So whether it's going to be eaten, whether it's going to be inhaled, whether it's going to be absorbed by the skin, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but just something to think about whenever you're using an herbicide or a pesticide. And you see these values here, LD50s. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that to put some of this stuff into context. So the LD50 is the amount of product that's needed to kill 50% of a population. So when they do animal studies to get an idea of how toxic various substances are, they break out animals into different groups and then they expose them to different levels of a material. In this case, we're pretending that that material is an herbicide. And when you get to a certain rate that it kills half of the amount of animals in the study group, that's considered your lethal dose of 50% or your LD50. So, obviously we don't want to be anywhere near theirs, but just to give you an idea, these LD50s then are fed into and utilized to kind of break in those caution, warning, and danger sorts of products to give you an idea of how acutely toxic something is to you. So here's a list, because everything can be toxic, even if you're talking about table sugar. We all know that eating a lot of sugar over time is not good, but you can actually eat enough sugar that it could have an acutely toxic problem to you. So while sugar is considered practically non-toxic, if you ate 30,000 milligrams per kilogram of sugar, it could be a toxic dose. So to put this kind of in context, if you had 160-pound human, it would take them to eat 2,200 grams of sugar for it to kill them, or about 4 pounds of sugar. For glyphosate, an herbicide for an acutely toxic dose, it would be about 420 grams. Table salt, it would be about 225 grams or about half a pound. And then, some of these other materials like caffeine that are significantly more toxic. So, to give you an idea of what toxicity is, you can look right on the jug and see that signal word. So, here for this Roundup Max Control product, it's a caution-based product, so relatively non-toxic. Where this high yield grass killer, it has warning on the label right there. So this is something that is a bit more toxic. I'd like to point out and get on a little bit of a soapbox here because there's a lot of information out there about vinegar and how well vinegar and salt kill weeds. And they certainly do kill weeds. This is a vinegar product or an acetic acid product that's 20% for organic production. So this is an organic weed killer. But if you look at that signal word, it's actually a danger product. So it is more acutely toxic to you than, either of these other products that we were looking at before. And if you look, the reason is because it causes irreversible eye damage. And it's harmful if it's absorbed through the skin, harmful if swallowed. Acetic acid, once you get to about 11%, can actually melt cells. And that's why, the 20% and the 40% solutions are really good at killing weeds, but they also have the ability to melt our cells. So they're actually a pretty dangerous product when you're looking at them. And then you can see all the personal protective equipment that you need to utilize when you're using a product like this. And I just wanted to bring this to attention because there's a lot of products that aren't pesticides. And well, pesticides, we're talking about all that heavy regulation and all those signal words and all the things that pesticides have to protect us in the environment. A lot of things like industrial cleaners are not actually regulated in the same way. So these products being 50% vinegar, 80% vinegar, more than double or four times the organic product I just showed you. These are industrial straight cleaners or degreasers, not marketed as pesticides, so they don't have to have those signal words right on the jug. And well, these are very toxic products. If you look at some of the reviews, you can't always trust what you say. Safe for pets, non-toxic, non-cancerous, even though these things are very dangerous poisons. And the last one I would say is that there's a lot of gardening forums out there about acetic acid in particular. Again, saying safe for pets, no dilution, contains no harsh chemicals. But then when you zoom up, that's actually a danger product, one of the most acutely toxic products that you could be utilizing to control weeds. Very effective for small weeds, but I just wanted to throw that out there when you're talking about toxicity. Get a lot of questions about that when it comes to home gardens. However, with toxicity, it's all about the amount that you're exposed to. So even if you're using a caution-based pesticide, you want to make sure that you're going to prevent exposure to your body. So whenever you're using any sort of pesticide, you really want to utilize good PPE. And this is right on the label. Again, you need to read the label whenever you're using a pesticide, and it'll tell you the exact types of equipment that you need to utilize. You almost always want to wear protective eyewear, chemical resistant gloves, long sleeve shirt, pants, closed toed shoes, and then any other additional PPE that is listed on that label. So to getting to herbicides more specifically now, I like to talk a little bit about that toxicity and such up front because that's where it seems like there's a lot of misinformation out there, or information that people have questions on. Is that whenever you're trying to control a weed, the first step in any program is you need to know what the weed is so that you can understand the biology of that weed and then target the weaknesses of that biology to actually get at and kill that plant. So, in an IPM program, once you know what it is, then you can utilize a variety of different methods, whether it's physical, mechanical, biological, to actually control that weed. There's a lot of webinars on those sorts of things. So we're going to be talking about a chemical control, specifically for weeds and specifically for herbicides in the next 30, 40 minutes. So when you go to a store and you're trying to choose an herbicide, well, the first thing is, well, maybe you don't even need a pesticide. If you just have a couple of annual plants, you can just pull them up with your hand. You don't necessarily need to spray them. When you have hundreds and thousands of them, it becomes a situation where you might want a pesticide. So when you're choosing an herbicide, first you need to know your species and then you need to know the growth stage because pesticides are going to be specific for species and growth stage. So generally, weeds, whether you're doing it by hand or with chemicals, are going to be much easier to control when they're small seedlings, like this puncture vine. Once you let them grow big, it's harder to pull them and it's harder to control them with chemistries. Or, in certain instances, you might want to control weeds before they germinate, targeting that seed bank. And we'll talk about some herbicides that you can utilize for that. But again, when you're thinking about the herbicide, it's not just about the species, but it's about the desirable species. Is this in a yard? Is this in a vegetable garden? Are there desirable species that you don't want to do harm to? And then, the specific site that's listed on the label. Different products will say whether you can apply them in turf grass or driveways or vegetable beds. And you are only allowed to apply herbicides on the sites that are listed on the label. So these are three different things that you need to consider when choosing an herbicide: the species, desirable plants, and then what site it's actually going to be utilized on. So now to shift gears and really focus and dig down into some herbicide information, I wanted to get into some definitions. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is selectivity. So most people, when they think about herbicides, they think, okay, herbicide, it's going to kill all plants. Well, actually, that's very uncommon. Most herbicides don't have activity on all species of plants, and they only control plants at very specific growth stages, applied at very specific times. And we have a few herbicides that are relatively non-selective, but most herbicides only kill some plants sometimes. And this selectivity of an herbicide can also be manipulated in a couple of different ways. So certain species are going to be susceptible to certain herbicides. And so that's one thing. Plant species can really affect selectivity. Herbicide type can affect selectivity. And this is often why you can apply herbicides safely over the top of crops. Application timing can affect selectivity, applying when some things are dormant and other things might not be. And then that growth stage is really important for how selective an herbicide can be. Another way is to avoid contact, altering your application technique. So here's, someone who has a wand sprayer and they just want to kill this weed right here, and they don't want to have any drift kind of go on some of their desirable plants. So they've put this shield around their sprayer so that they'll just get the herbicide on this plant. So in that case, you could use an herbicide that kills a lot of plants and, not harm some of the plants around it. So kind of an interesting idea. One thing that I would point out with these, if you do it, it's a good idea, but you will get droplets that fall off of this cone that can, get on other plants. So just something to be careful with. The other definition that I wanted to talk about is soil activity. Some herbicides only have soil activity and they're going to have impacts on seeds. Some herbicides only have post-emergent activity. So you need above ground plant material to take that spray and to have activity. And then certain herbicides have both. They'll have impacts on the soil and seed banks, but then they'll also have impacts on actively growing plants. For herbicides that have impacts on actively growing plants, they can be broken down in a couple of different ways. The first way is contact versus systemic. So contact means that it doesn't move through the plant. So looking at these pictures of these plants here, you can see all these red, brown spots. That's where that product actually landed and hit the leaf, and that's where it killed. But it's not moved throughout the plant. So contact products don't move throughout the plant, and they're only going to kill what they touch. So coverage is really important for contact products. You want to cover the entire leaf surface in order to get a good kill. And you're only going to kill the top of the plant. You're not going to get movement down to the root. So lots of our organic herbicides, our vinegars, oils, those are contact products, as well as some of our synthetic chemistries. For our systemic products, generally you're looking at synthetic products. There aren't really organic systemics out there. And these are products that are absorbed by the plant and then move down into the root of that plant to get you a good kill. For our pre-emergent herbicides, or products that have activity on the soil that can suppress that seed bank, generally these need to be applied to the soil surface. And then they're essentially act as a blanket that prevent seeds from germinating through it. In order for these to be effective, they need to be incorporated, typically by moisture. So, in areas that are dry land, they need to be rained in. So generally fall and spring applications work better when we know we're going to have rain to push those materials into the soil. Otherwise, they just sit on top and they don't do a lot of good. Or this can be done by irrigation. Some of these pre-emergent herbicides won't have any impact on desirable plant roots, and others will move down into that plant profile and can be taken up by trees and shrubs and cause problems. So it's important to know which one you're utilizing, and that information can be found on the label in terms of, kind of that off-target impact and if you need to be careful of the root zone. For post-emergent herbicides or things that are going to be absorbed by the plant, generally you need active growth. So plants that are small, actively growing and moving sugars throughout them are going to be the most successfully controlled by post-emergent herbicides. If you have big weeds that are in the middle of the summer and they're drought stressed and they're not actively growing, they're not going to move products through them nearly as well. So now to get into some specific herbicides, again, some more definitions to break them down. We have, your conventional or synthetic herbicides, and these are materials like glyphosate that, are synthetically driven. And we have a whole bunch of them. Like I mentioned, we have about 260 of them. And the way that they work isn't necessarily important. But it is important for you to know that there's different herbicides that work in different ways. And the way that they work is considered their mode of action. This is physiologically how they work in the plant to kill the plant, what pathway they stop, or what part of the plant physiology are they acting on? And we have 33 of these different modes of action, some of which that have a lot of different herbicides in them, like the ALS inhibitors, and some of which just have a couple of herbicides in them. There's a lot more out there than just glyphosate, that's for sure. When it comes to organic products, these are pesticides that are made of compounds that occur in nature. And if you're looking for organic products, you really want to be looking for this OMRI certification. And they are also chemistries. Just like caprylic acid, here's the chemical formula for that. So, just because they're natural doesn't mean that they're not a chemical. So getting into some of the characteristics, I wanted to talk a bit about what you need to be looking for first. Whenever you're looking at a pesticide jug in a store, you want to be looking at the active ingredients. You don't necessarily want to be looking at the trade name. Trade names change. You want to be looking at that active ingredient and the percent of active ingredient because that's really what you're buying and that's really what's been tested in terms of its effectiveness. So thinking about active ingredients is a good way. You kind of want to look at that before you look at the trade name. So to talk about organic herbicides first, bunch of different organic options. Like I mentioned before, organic products are typically contact products. So these are things that are really good at controlling small, recently emerged weeds. And they're fabulous at it. Most contact products, whether they're organic or synthetic, that's what you target. You target weeds that have a couple of leaves on them and they are recently emerged, generally less than a few inches tall. So for our organic herbicides, first we have some of our acids. I already mentioned vinegar or acetic acid. We have caprylic acid, capric acid, citric acid, ammonium soaps of fatty acids. And again, these are all good at dissolving cells. We also have a lot of oils. I didn't list them all here, but things like clove oil, cinnamon oil, citrus oil, lemongrass oil. These can all be utilized again to control small, recently emerged weeds, essentially by melting their cells. And then, some other contact organic herbicides, like eugenol, sodium lauryl sulfate, ammonium nonate, and a couple of examples here. So I wanted to, show some data from a few of our colleagues who have done quite a bit of work with organic herbicides, more work than I've done. Carrie Wendell Rojas and Chris McDonald have done a lot of work, but I wanted to show this graphic from Maggie Reeder, who used to work for UC Extension and Turf. And she was looking at, various different herbicides. So quite a few different organic herbicides and then glyphosate. And when I talk about, they're good at controlling recently emerged weeds and annuals, they're not necessarily good at controlling those perennials because they don't move down to the root. So if you look at this graphic, this is turf grass with all these different treatments and then days after treatment. So you can see like D-limone, ammonium soap of fatty acids, these things brown the heck out of that turf immediately. They essentially gave it a haircut and burned the top of that turf off 2 days after application. So they worked really quick. By 35 days after treatment, you couldn't really tell what had been treated compared to the untreated check. Where, some of the things that have systemic activity, killed the turf as you would expect. I would also like to give a really big shout out to this Green Bulletin article that Carrie wrote. We'll be providing a link to you, but here it is in the slides. And she looked at a variety of different alternatives to glyphosate, a lot of different contact products, many of which that were organic and some of which that weren't. And, we have all these different products and the days after treatment. So you can see, 1 and 6 days after treatment, she was getting about 70% control with some of these products. And then that control started to fall off as things started to regrow. So she came in and made another application, and same thing, really good burn down. And then as time went on, more things started to germinate, some plants started to grow back, and not as good a control. So the best control she was getting for grasses was about 80%. For some of the broadleaf weeds, they were getting, 80, 90% control with some of those second applications. But again, these plants, you would brown them up and, kill that first flush. And then as you had more germinate and bigger ones start to regrow, that control would go down over time. So it was taking multiple applications. And I encourage you to check out and read this publication that she has. She put a really awesome table in this publication, as well as some great photos. So this is showing, that untreated check, and then applied one of these contact products, burned everything back right to the ground, nothing growing. But by 3 days out, you're starting to see a bit of recovery with some of these weeds. So again, these contact products, whether they're organic or synthetic, really good at controlling small weeds. But if you have weeds that are bigger, they're probably going to grow out of it. With this table that she has all these different herbicides, I like it because she broke it down by signal word, whether it's organic, and then also the price. And this is really important to me because a lot of these products that she was testing, some of these, acid products, they're $10, $11 per square foot, or per $10, $11 per 1,000 square feet, which can get pretty spendy if you're doing big areas. If you only have a small yard and small areas, a lot of these organic products fit right into a really good management system. I'd also like to point out that coverage really matters when you're talking about organic products, and it'll be right there on the label about how much to put in the water and how much to spray. I stole this from TJ Mason at Colorado State, where he was looking at coverage of caprylic acid applications. And when they were only putting on 20 gallons an acre or 40 gallons an acre, this is a high rate of water for synthetic pesticides. They weren't essentially getting any control. But when they bumped it up and they were getting really good coverage and they were really soaking those plants at a lot of carrier volume per acre, they were getting really good control. So with organic options, mainly just contact products, but I did want to mention there's quite a bit of information out there about corn gluten meal. So corn gluten meal is an organic product that has a decent amount of nitrogen in it. And it has been shown in quite a few greenhouse trials to have good pre-emergent activity. So activity not on actively growing plants, but activity on that seed bank. In some cases in greenhouse trials, providing 50 to 90% control. For most of the field studies that I've seen with corn gluten meal, you're lucky to get much more than 70% control. So, really good suppression, but not necessarily, that lights out control that you might be looking for to knock out a seed bank. But certainly something to look into. And I encourage you to look at this review by Cornell that we're providing some information to that details a lot of these different studies. But something that can be used organically for suppression of the seed bank for certain weed species. So for kind of the overview of some of these organic herbicides, really good at small weeds, really good at small areas, but they can be expensive and you might be looking to do repeat applications, and you're not really going to be able to get after perennial weeds if they're already established with organic herbicides. In terms of shifting gears down to some of our conventional herbicides and when you might want to use them, a lot of different materials I just wanted to throw out there have information out there like fast acting. So there's different products like diquat and pelargonic acid that are also contact products. So just like those organic herbicides, they don't move throughout the plant. They're only going to kill what they touch. And this is typically two products that you're going to see whenever you're looking at a fast acting sort of herbicide. So they're often in a mix with other products. For many different homeowner products, it's not just going to be one active ingredient. You're going to have a mix of different active ingredients in there. So the first kind of the second type of group of herbicides that I wanted to talk about are grass killers. So these are your ACC-ACE inhibitors, your FOPs, and your DIMs, and these only have activity on grasses. They don't kill broadleaf plants. So you can actually use these often right over the top of ornamental beds and vegetable gardens because they're not going to kill the broadleaf and they're only going to kill the grass. They work best on small, recently emerged annual grasses. Again, smaller the weed, the better. But with repeat application, you can get control of perennial grasses. And these are things like acethoxydim, clozapop, and clethodim. Looking at these two concentrated products, you can see their warning labels, where if you go to one of these ready-to-use products with the same active ingredient, it's a caution label because there's more water in the container. And when there's more water, that toxicity goes down. The next herbicides that I wanted to talk about are our broadleaf killers or our synthetic auxin herbicides. Generally, these can be sprayed safely over the top of grasses to kill broadleaf weeds. So here's a field trial that I had where we killed a bunch of teasel and left a bunch of grasses alone. So these are things like 2,4-D, dicamba, MCPA, triclopyr, copyrrolid. And I wanted to break these down a little bit further and talk about a few of them specifically. So the first one is triclopyr. This does have activity on a wide variety of broadleaf plants, but this one is really known as a tree killer or a brush killer. Really good activity on things like blackberries and poison oak as a foliar application, but it can also be applied to stumps. If you have a tree that you've cut down and you don't want it to resprout, you can apply things like triclopyr with a paintbrush to that stump to get good control of it. It's called a cut stump treatment. And for trees, vines, brush, this is kind of a go-to product. And typically what you'll see in most of these brush killer herbicides that you'll find at Home Depot or Ace. Copyrrolid is a product that's a bit more of a ranchette use product, not necessarily a homeowner use product. But if you have a little bit of acreage, I wanted to throw it out there because it has really good activity on yellow star thistles. Some of our other thistles are knapweeds. This is a really good product for some of those. And it has both post-emergent activity, but also some pre-emergent activity to give you control of that seed bank. For most broadleaf weed control, and where most people I think are doing a lot of broadleaf weed control is in grass or in turf. And for most of these turf products, you're going to get a combination of different systemic auxin herbicides or broadleaf killers. 2,4-D, dicamba, MCPA are all common herbicides that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see triclopyr in there as well. And by including multiple chemicals in the tank, it really broadens the spectrum so that they can put claims on here like kills 470 plus weeds because they're using multiple different chemistries. One product that I did want to throw out, or one active ingredient, is quinqueralac, and this has really good control of crabgrass. So anytime you see crabgrass on a label, it's probably going to have some quinqueralac in it. And just to throw it out there, quinqueralac actually also has really good activity on bindweed. So if you have bindweed in your yard, choosing one that has that crabgrass killer in there can be pretty important. For weed and feeds from an IPM program, they're not necessarily my favorite, mainly because, I don't like using more chemical than I have to. So two questions. If you need fertilizer, and you have weeds, then a weed and feed can be good. But if you answer no to either fertilizer or weeds, then I would just prefer to use a fertilizer or a weed killer or an herbicide alone and not, buy one of this pre-mixed thing. And a lot of people will apply this every year, whether they have weeds or not. And generally, these are granular formulations where you have fertilizer that's impregnated with some of these broadleaf killers like 2,4-D, dicamba, and MCPA. The next product that I wanted to talk about is glyphosate. And this is probably the one that everybody's heard of, when you're thinking about weeds and when you're seeing it on the news. And this is a relatively unique herbicide in the sense that it's relatively broad spectrum. It'll kill essentially everything that's actively growing. Has activity on grasses, broadleafs, trees, brush, but it needs active green vegetation to be taken in. So it's a very sticky substance, so it actually will bind to the soil almost immediately after being applied or bind to organic matter. So this is one of the reasons why glyphosate is used so commonly in cropping systems, is because it's highly effective and because you can come back and you can plant the next day and it's not going to have any impact on those seeds. So an excellent product if you're planning on planting afterwards. It's also a really good product for spot treatments. Even though it'll kill everything that's actively growing, if you don't spray all the plants and you just spray the weed, this is one that can be very effective. I wanted to point out another green bulletin because there's a lot of information out there in the news and popular press about toxicity and cancer, and providing some links to some UC information as well as some EP information on that, because I'm sure that everybody's heard of the lawsuits. And I really wanted to point this out in terms of Roundup, which is what most people associate glyphosate with. Glyphosate equals Roundup. Well, that's no longer the case for homeowners. They've changed it. So Roundup now that you buy at Ace Hardware, it used to be glyphosate. Now Roundup, what they've done because of the lawsuits, is they're putting triclopyr, which is a broadleaf killer, fluazafop, which is a grass killer, and then diquat, which is something that's going to burn it down quick. So no more glyphosate in Roundup that you buy at the store as a homeowner. If you're buying Roundup professionally, they still sell it as glyphosate. But you're getting a tank mix of a broadleaf killer and a grass killer. So just a couple other examples. Roundup for lawns. This is not a glyphosate product. These are a couple of grass killers. They're not grass killers, but broadleaf killers. And then Roundup 365, or where you want total vegetation control. Again, no glyphosate, but a triclopyr and a broadleaf killer, a grass killer, and a browner, as well as a pre-emergent material. So you can still get glyphosate at Ace Hardware or Home Depot or wherever you're going to buy things, but it's not going to be labeled Roundup anymore. In terms of total vegetation control, this is something that you got to be a little bit careful with. It's typically a pre-emergent product and a post-emergent product together. So you'll have something like glyphosate, or, in this case, a Roundup 65. We saw a couple of different post-emergent products mixed with a pre-emergent product. So commonly, you'll have your post-emergent product with a Mazapic, or your post-emergent product, whether it's Ortho Ground Clear, with a Mazapir, which has pre-emergent activity, and then pelargonic acid that has post-emergent activity. The reason why I want to point these out is because if you look at the label and you're looking at the label, these are great where you don't want anything to grow. So if you have a driveway with nothing else around it, this is a great material to utilize, on a dirt driveway or dirt gravel. But all three of these products have information on the label about how they can be taken up by tree roots. So both, a Mazapic and a Mazapir can actually be uptaken by roots of desirable vegetation. So if you have a bunch of gravel and then you have desirable tree roots that are underneath it and you spray some of this stuff, you can actually hurt your trees or your shrubs or other things that have roots in that zone. So something just to be aware of. Good things if you want total vegetation control, but not around desirable plants. If you want to suppress a seed bank where you have some desirable root zones, there's a bunch of different products that have pre-emergent control, but aren't necessarily going to be taken up by roots of desirable species. So these are things like some of our preen products, a vegetable weeder from Monterey, Coruscant granules. So these are things that are microtubular inhibitors that prevent seeds from growing. Trifuralin, Arazolan, and pendimethalin, and then some of our cellulose biosynthesis inhibitors, dicobenonyl and isoxaben. I kind of butchered that first one. So with these pre-emergent herbicides, oftentimes they can be utilized around established ornamentals or established plants because they're not going to be taken up by roots. One thing that I would say is, again, they need to be incorporated. So oftentimes they'll need to be reined in to be effective. And you really need to be careful with pre-emergent herbicides in terms of areas where you want to plant again, because they do have activity on seeds. So whether you're using one that can be used around established perennials safely, to prevent seeds from germinating, or some of those bare ground products, you really want to think about where you're applying those and if you have any plans to plant later in the year. And you can find information on the label about how soon you can plant afterwards. When it comes to herbicides, I would say that, the proper growth stage can't be overstated. Smaller weeds are easier to kill than bigger weeds. And to steal, some terminology from Earl Creech out at Utah State, don't go after your trophy weeds. You want to go after those small weeds. You don't want to wait until they get big. In terms of what plants to target with what herbicides, annuals and biennials, you can target those with many of those pre-emergent products. You can target them with contact products when they're small. Once they get too big, the contact products don't work as well. And then systemic products will work well for annuals and biennials. One thing with annuals and biennials is you want to think about multiple flushes. So oftentimes if you spray something, or you kill one flush of weeds, you're going to have more germination in a couple of weeks. So something to think about, and a reason why you might want to utilize a pre-emergent herbicide to keep more seeds from germinating after you've made an individual application. For perennials, you really need systemic herbicides that are going to get down into that root. Something like glyphosate, something like 2,4-D or dicamba, that's going to move throughout the plant and kill that root. And again, you need to read the label to see what products are going to kill what species, as well as what use site they can be utilized on. In terms of application types and formulations, we have granular products that can be spread out on the soil. These are often pre-emergent products. We have ready-to-use products, so things that you can buy right off the shelf that have a nozzle on them that you can go and spray weeds. These can be great if you have small areas, but you're buying a lot of water with these sort of formulations. For lawns, we have things that can be hooked up to hoses or hose end applicators, whether they're pre-mixed or whether you're going to mix your own. And then if you have a lot of weed killing to do, oftentimes buying concentrate and mixing your own in a little gallon sprayer can be a good way to go about it and be a bit more economical. The last one that I'd like to point out is weed wicks. Weed wicks can be used primarily with glyphosate. It's essentially, a sponge or a wick applicator where you can touch exactly the weeds that you want to target. So this can be a really good way to use an herbicide effectively without having to worry about spray drift and those sorts of things. So again, always read the label. It's going to tell you how much to mix and your active ingredients. It's going to tell you information about first aid. It's going to tell you information about how to protect yourself, what sort of PPE to use, and then where you can use it and how to use it. All this information is on the label, and you really need to read and understand the whole thing, because you don't want to under apply because you might not get a good kill, and you don't want to over apply because it's a waste. You can have off target impacts and it's illegal. When it comes to protecting, other species, we want to be responsible. Generally, whenever applying a pesticide, you don't want to spray flowering plants. I point this out because we're spraying a flowering dandelion in the graphic that we utilize to advertise this seminar. Generally, you want to spray plants that don't have flowers, because then they won't be attracted to pollinators, or pollinators won't be attracted to them. I also wanted to throw a shout out to the UCB precaution pesticide ratings, but I just found out about this before the webinar. UC actually has a pesticide ingredient active database for homeowners that outlines all the environmental impacts of pesticides by active ingredient. So this is an awesome place to get really good information about what active ingredients you're utilizing and what impacts they might have on the environment, as well as how to utilize them responsibly. When you're talking about herbicides, you always have to mention off-target movement. A lot of really good information from Kasim we're providing some information to, but this is the idea that the spray doesn't go where you want it to. Whether it's physically moving in drift, where you have particles that are blowing in the wind, Don't spray in the wind. You only want to spray when conditions are calm or when herbicides are volatilizing and moving in the environment. So these are very common with things like our lawn herbicides, 2,4-D dicamba, especially at higher temperatures. They will actually off gas and then move in the environment. And things like grapes and tomatoes can be sensitive to parts per billion. So you want to make sure that you're not spraying in the wind, and you don't want to spray when it's too hot outside. The last thing that I wanted to mention was herbicide resistance. And this is the idea that when you use an herbicide over and over again, you can select for plants that used to be killed by that herbicide, but are no longer killed by that herbicide. And this is called herbicide resistance. And you can get plants that are no longer susceptible. We've had a lot of herbicide resistance develop really ever since we started using herbicides. And we have a fair amount of herbicide resistance in California, specifically to some of the products like glyphosate and some of our grass killers. And I want to point this out because if you're making an application, especially if you're around, agricultural areas or roadways, and a plant that you think should die doesn't die, there is potential if you got that application right and the timing right, that plant is actually resistant. Maybe it came in from a roadside or an agricultural area. And it's important that you want to pull those plants or kill those plants before they have the potential to produce more seeds. So for minimizing resistance, integrating different control methods. But as a homeowner, if something doesn't die when you think it should, you really want to control it another way, whether it's mowing or string trimming or something like that. For more information on herbicides and in general, great resources at UC IPM with UC Extension. Don't forget to rely on your master gardeners. They're highly trained and very important people to ask questions of. And one thing that I would like to say is I really like to go after vetted information. So I like other university extension service information. I am careful when I'm talking about garden blogs and Reddit and some of those things because that information isn't always, might be taken with a grain of salt. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. So when using herbicides, like Spider-Man's uncle says, with great power comes great responsibility. These are highly effective tools that we want to be able to use responsibly so that we can get the outcomes that we want and not have any of those off-target impacts. So always read the label, understand the label, and when using an herbicide, it really comes down to the species you're trying to kill, the desirable species you have on site, and then that site, and using these as part of an IPM program so that hopefully, like you in this picture, you can control the plants that you don't want, in this case, invasive annual grass, and release, the plants that you do want, in this case, a bunch of native perennials. In your case, it might be some tomatoes in your vegetable garden. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. And here's my contact info.
Thank you, Tom, for that great presentation about herbicides.